Hello, my name is Amy Matherly. I've been teaching students to play the violin and viola for over 30 years. I was frustrated early on in my teaching career because I couldn't find a scale book that worked for my beginning and intermediate students. To me, the ideal scale book for students at those levels would have only scales and arpeggios, contain 1, 2, and 3 octave scales and arpeggios in a single volume, and provide clear explanations of relevant music theory concepts. I knew what I wanted, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So I decided to create it myself. The result? Progressive Scales for Violin, and our newest release, Progressive Scales for Viola. I'm going to show you inside those books in a second, but first, let's go back to describing the ideal scale book for beginning and intermediate students. Remember my first requirement? The ideal scale book for beginning and intermediate students would have only scales and arpeggios. Rather than packing each page with scales, multiple arpeggios, chromatic scales, thirds, and double stops, the perfect scale book for beginning and intermediate students would contain only scales and the tonic arpeggio, focusing on what they need at that stage in their development. I wanted something straightforward so my students wouldn't be overwhelmed, a simple and unintimidating presentation to get the students started on this important aspect of their music education. Take a look at progressive scales. 1 octave. 2 octaves, 3 octaves. Clean, simple, and effective. Requirement number 1, check. Now, let's get back to my list of requirements for the ideal scale book. The ideal scale book for beginning and intermediate students would have only scales and arpeggios and contain 1, 2, and 3 octave scales and arpeggios in a single volume. Including 1, 2, and 3 octave scales and arpeggios in a single volume allows students to learn a scale and then build on it, adding layers of complexity as their skills evolve. In progressive scales, students begin with the lower octave, adding on the second octave when they're ready, and then the third. Fingerings are consistent from one octave to the next to ease the transition. When the need arises to simplify or review, one can just flip back to the easier version. They're all there. Requirement number 2, check. One more time, back to my list of requirements for the ideal scale book. The ideal scale book for my beginning and intermediate students would have only scales and arpeggios, contain 1, 2, and 3 octave scales and arpeggios in a single volume, and provide clear explanations of relevant music theory concepts. As a result of the obscure information I received as a student, I was confused by music theory. I developed a fear of the subject and avoided it as much as possible. I vowed to introduce music theory to my students early. I would provide clear explanations with direct application so that they would understand and even enjoy it. Let's take a look at some excerpts from progressive scales. In these sample pages, students are provided explanations of sharps, flats, and key signatures, major and minor modes and arpeggios, and scale patterns. As you can see, progressive scales gently introduces the theory underlying scales, arpeggios, and key signatures. Often, questions about these fundamentals go unanswered because they seem obvious to those of us who have lived with them for years. We even included a helpful diagram of the circle of fifths so that students can locate their scales on it and become comfortable with the concept. Requirement number 3, check. A quick recap. Progressive Scales for Violin and Progressive Scales for Viola, the ideal scale books for beginning and intermediate students, contain only scales and arpeggios, contain 1, 2, and 3 octave scales and arpeggios in a single volume, and provide clear explanations of relevant music theory concepts. This fall, I have been using it to further my students' understanding of music theory and advance their skills in reading and shifting. With the clean presentation of each scale and arpeggio, all 3 octaves in one volume, and clear theory explanations, Progressive Scales has everything your students need to develop a solid facility with the scales that are the basis for the music they're learning. So, buy your copy today. You'll love it. Just click on the links below to add Progressive Scales for Violin or Progressive Scales for Viola to your CAM Publications cart. Thanks!